All right, let's flip the classroom. On Unit 7, we're doing a project in lieu of a test. We have looked at some of these slides previously, and some of them will be brand new to us, and we'll split this into a series of shorter length videos. So, part one, let's go over the EQs and make sure that you can tailor your topic and presentation around at least one of these EQs. So, I'll try to pick apart a few different examples, but by no means is this going to be exhaustive. So, if you're looking at the first EQ, what political, economic, and social cultural conditions contribute to the need for reform? Well, you could rephrase this to think about what the triggers were behind some of the reform movements that existed in the progressive era. So if you're looking at the Chinese Exclusion Act, actually, you could sort of flip the question and think about how the Chinese Exclusion Act triggered an impetus for subsequent reform. Although, just so you're aware, people that are doing that topic, there really was no reform with regard to the Chinese Exclusion Act specifically because that was not repealed until the World War II era. But you could certainly think about how it contributed to the bigger question of immigration as a whole, and also questions about the 14th Amendment. So, looking at question two, to what extent is the need for reform a top down versus grassroots movement? So, let's take the child labor group, for example, here. And that's a few of you, actually. So, think about the ways in which the child labor movement originated more from a local level and also from a demographic that did not, at least traditionally, have a political voice. I'm speaking of women more specifically. That women really rallied behind the causes of child labor reform earlier than the mainstream, and we can consider why they took up this cause. And in addition to that, you can think about how ultimately child labor reform took shape in subsequent legislation. So, sort of think about the extent to which both of these forces are occurring. The other thing that you could think of if you're doing child labor is the extent to which American child labor legislation was influenced by European child labor legislation, which was already in place. All right, and then the last question, to what extent was the United States trend toward reform and change a global affair? Well, let's see, which group have I not touched upon yet? I did mention immigration previously, but if you are researching immigration, you could consider, of course, this question, right? Think about the ways in which the immigration related legislation in and around the progressive era uh, started to shape the understanding of geez, how does one say this? If you're looking into immigration, you may be actually studying things like the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924, and if you haven't, I highly suggest that you do, and you'll see why if you look it up, right? You can consider the extent to which American immigration legislation was centered upon race, was centered upon religion, centered upon traditional alliances. There's a lot to that you could really unpack. You could also, if you're not really looking at that angle of immigration, if you're looking into your own personal narrative, your own personal history, you could certainly, consider the extent to which different members working in the same group are representing different parts of the globe and the significance behind that. So, in any event, I'll stop there. But you see ways in which we can apply all of the different topics to these different questions, and by no means should you be married to just one question. All right, so guided questions. Really, I just want to read these and then let them speak for themselves. Okay, so how can you apply the content to the EQs? You can play with these more content oriented questions that are still quite broad. So, to what extent are the goals and outcomes of the populist and progressive eras aligned and why? Now, this one, quite frankly, as I record, I'm sort of smiling here because I might it really reconsider whether or not we dove into the populist era enough to really tackle that question. So instead, you could consider just the extent to which the goals and outcomes in general, just in the progressive era, are aligned. To what extent did they have one goal going into it, and then the actual outcome took a new form, and why might that matter? In what ways did the traditional progressive presidents, and they are Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. In what ways did they differ in their approaches toward progressive reform, and in what ways were their ideas aligned? So, first and foremost, I mentioned this in class, but Roosevelt and Taft are Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat. So that in itself uh, informs you that the progressive era was by no means just a one-party affair. In fact, there was a progressive party, there was a socialist party. Teddy Roosevelt runs again for president under his own party, the Bull Moose Party, and we will get into that briefly. And also, of course, in what ways did their ideas align? Well, of course, they were all so-called progressive presidents. In what ways did these different presidents envision progressivism differently? So, to what extent did American imperialism adhere to progressive ideals? And this is going to align much more with our discussion going into the World War I era, and that is how we will close here. All right, so those are the topics we're studying. So, let's talk a little bit about what the progressive era is. And actually, some of these movements that we'll talk about in the beginning are more closely aligned with the populist era. So if you are examining the first guided question, you can turn to these early slides here. So in any event, these are just really, really broad. I think they speak for themselves, but let's think about just what generally is going on in this era, right? So the industrial workforce, right? It's expanding because of migration and immigration at the same time, right? We're seeing quite a bit of movement and also just general population increase. With the end of the Civil War, we are seeing some, albeit limited because of Jim Crow, migration out of the South with the African American population. We will see that actually much more once we get closer to the 20th century, right? But in the years immediately after the Civil War, due to the ubiquitousness of sharecropping, it was much more difficult. All right, and then also labor management battled for control over wages and working conditions with workers organizing local and national unions and or directly confronting corporate power. So, I think you guys get what that means, of course. Um, in general, we're looking at the big picture nature of capitalism, for lack of a better word. That's what that general enduring understanding there is. All right, so let's look at the Great Railroad Strike. In fact, we did talk about these slides at length in class, so I want them to largely speak for themselves, right? So this was literally the same year as the end of Reconstruction, if you can recall. This was with regard to a transcontinental section of the railroad, right? And ultimately, you see the ramifications of this strike on the slide. So without actually reading them all, we see that a very violent event results in temporary martial law, and after that, the go-to strategy for employers was to ultimately use force to put down a labor movement. So that's the context behind the progressive era. In many ways, early efforts at reform were met with violent confrontations. So the Knights of Labor was one of the first, one could call it a union. It was very large, so not particularly specific. But the Knights of Labor was founded by Terence Powderly. Ultimately, it was seen as a way to organize workers in order to compete for better working conditions. This was a concept also known as collective bargaining. Uh, the general idea is that there is power in numbers. If you single-handedly try to negotiate a raise, you may or better working hours, you may not get anywhere. But if you and some of your fellow employees do the same thing, there will be most likely a much greater likelihood of return. In general, the Knights of Labor advocated an 8-hour workday, and that could be a reduction of quite a bit of time. There were many working class people that saw as much as a 16-hour workday, and that included some children. And in general, the Knights of Labor was not um, was was inclusive rather, sorry, and that meant that it accepted people of all races, of all labor skills, and women. So that allowed it to get quite large. All right, so skipping ahead, let's talk about the Haymarket Square Riot of 1886. Right, again, we talked about this in class, so really, really briefly. The context was that it was May Day. That is not typically celebrated in the United States, but in Europe, it's a significant labor holiday, and I believe that people have off. Not sure. But in any event, there were demonstrations across the United States as well on May Day, and they were all fighting for an 8-hour workday. Of course, members of the Knights of Labor were involved in this. And these were not just a single day event, they continued. And on May 3rd, there was a fight that broke out in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And it was a fight between scabs, or who were also strikebreakers, and the strikers themselves. And as all this is going on, um, there was, of course, increased press, there was increased attention to this event, so it grew in numbers after that, right? And then when I say union leaders, by the way, I think someone asked about this in class, I was talking about labor union. I know we were just talking about the Civil War, so we're not talking about the union in that context. So in any event, labor union leaders, they wanted a protest for this police brutality, they argued, on May 4th, right, in Haymarket Square. And during this major event, of course, like I said earlier, it generated a lot of press. So there was a bomb that went off, and a police officer died as a result. And this ensued in rioting, which was very difficult to, of course, put down, even with the police presence. And so, of course, the result was chaos, right? 8 alleged anarchists, were arrested and tried for conspiracy, and half of them were hanged. All right, and by the way, I believe, I don't have my notes right in front of my face, but I believe there was little to no proof that any of these anarchists were actually directly involved in the bombing. No one could determine when this bomb, or who threw this bomb, rather. All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of the unit, right? Let's talk about the progressive era, because that's really the bulk of our study when we're talking about reform. All right, so in any event, it was in many ways seen as a grassroots movement, although when it came to actual and lasting change, in many ways that had to happen more at the government level. But we'll see ways in which the legacies of progressivism live on largely through the people when we finish up this video series at the end, right? So in any event, all three of the presidents were considered progressives in at least some way, shape, or form, even though they were not all of the same party. And we do see, as a result of the progressive movement, for better or for worse, the government takes a more active role in our day to day lives afterward, in terms of not just domestic affairs, but also foreign affairs, because this also coincides with the imperialist era and World War One. And we can elaborate a little bit if we want to about how the progressive movement addressed American fears, but I think that sort of speaks for itself, right? In a lot of ways, the progressive movement was a call to respond to some of the negative effects of industrialization. All right, so actually, this slide does touch upon the first guided question. So, really, really briefly, let's think about ways in which these movements are similar and also ways in which they differ, right? And of course, we can consider the ways in which these are more complicated. But so both populists and progressives really wanted to break up monopolies and trusts. And they also pushed for major labor reforms, and they both supported more direct participation in the government. They may have disagreed on the means to achieve these ends, but still they could come to a consensus on all three of these major ideas that we see down below here. Um, let's talk about differences, right? So the progressive era in general was much more of an urban movement, whereas populism was largely comprised of farmers from the South and West. Populism was, and progressivism for that matter, were not necessarily completely united, even if they had the same goal. Uh, just in very general terms. Oftentimes, these reform movements were divided by race. Sometimes they were even divided by age or political ideology. And we can get into that when we talk about specific examples. The populace also were generally regarded as poor and uneducated, although one could certainly dispute that in certain regards. And the progressives, in general, were regarded as more educated and from upper classes, and to a certain extent, there is some truth to that. In particular, we could look to the women's suffrage movement, which was largely orchestrated by educated women, uh, although by no means was it restricted to them. And also, populism did have some political successes, and again, it was more at the local level, but it was more of a movement among the people. Or rather, while progressivism had a stronger hold on the government, and progressive origins were often at the state level, and then they emerged to the federal level subsequently. So we think about some of the most long lasting legacies of the progressive movement, examples like the 19th Amendment, they largely occurred towards the very end of this movement, and they again were the longest lasting. Okay, so again, there's no one size fits all formula to progressives, and I do not want to spend any more time talking about this. I think we get the point of these slides that we already really discussed in class. All right, we talked about Margaret Sanger. We already know about that. Types of progressives, right? We already definitely touched upon these three, right? We could sort of break these down into social, political, and economic progressives, although by no means, of course, did you have to be just one of these categories, but in general, these are the different examples that we like to discuss. All right, socialism, right? We definitely talked about this, so really, really briefly, right? Of course, again, there's no one size fits all formula to socialism either, as we discussed a little bit in class. The most prominent American socialist was Eugene V. Debs, who we see over here on the right, and then also here he is. This is one of his presidential tickets. Um, Debs was regarded as a democratic socialist because he sought out election in the traditional process. And he actually did garner a significant proportion of votes. He ran for president multiple times, including his final time he ran for president when he was in prison for protesting U.S. involvement in World War One. I believe that he won up to 10% of the popular vote during one of those elections. Although, again, I don't have my notes in front of me. Apologies. But this was a very, very significant accomplishment for socialism in the United States. Although it did die down in the wake of World War One, and of course in the wake of World War Two with the coming of the Cold War. Moving forward. Okay, we definitely did not talk about the IWW in class, and I do want to touch upon that, and then we're going to take a break and do another uh, part two video after that, right? So, the IWW, who were they? It stands for the Industrial Workers of the World. They were also nicknamed the Wobblies, and they were largely radical workers, right? So, we're thinking about um, oftentimes jobs that were not particularly organized. Of course, you could maybe surmise that in the mining industry, you were sort of isolated in your community. So this was a difficult undertaking to say the least, but this did give mining workers in the West, in particular, quite a bit of leverage over their employers. The leader we can see here, this is Big Bill Haywood, and the IWW tried to form unions of the least organized and the lowest paid workers, right? So, sort of working specifically for the underdog, which was why it was seen as radical. They took they took the most direct action that they possibly could in order to achieve their goals. Their most frequent strategy was striking, and they actually gained some power on the East Coast, but they were much more successful in some of those, again, more difficult to regulate industries such as mining in the West. They did garner significant support, though, from people on the East Coast that represented somewhat influential people. That more specifically was the sort of intellectual community in New York City. And they oftentimes were surrounded by the more elitist upper middle class nature of the progressive movement. They rejected that, and so they were more inclined to support the IWW. So another example, actually, of American radicalism, and many Wobblies, for that matter, also identified with the socialist movement in some way, shape, or form. So socialism and progressivism were not the same thing during this era, at the very least. One could debate the connection between those two words in the modern day, but in any event, it's a little different. Okay, cool. So let's stop and do a part two by talking a little bit about political progressivism in the next part. All right? Stay tuned and thanks.